gentlemen, I'm really happy that you have come so numerous and that we can really start on time. I shall endeavor to be brief. I will chair this event, and then I'll give the floor to our guest, Ráquel Fernández. So I will make some brief introductory comments, and then after the presentation, we'll have time for a debate, which I'm sure will be very interesting. Let me introduce myself. I am Stefano Salis. I am a journalist. I'm not an economist. I deal with cultural issues for the Sole 24 Ore newspaper. I'd like to thank the organizers of the festival for offering me the opportunity to deal once and again with issues which indeed are related with the economy, but which have a much wider cultural horizon. If you are not yet aware of the work by Ráquel Fernández, she deals with the relationship between cultural attitudes and ways of interpreting one's own life in the society as a whole and the economic outcome. Well, these two elements are not so distant as they might appear at first sight. These are elements which are very difficult to quantify. The present recent economic theories are making an attempt to better understand the impact of wage production, while at the same time neglecting what is known as social capital, which comes before production activities, i.e. what are the cultural attitudes which bring about culture. Ráquel Fernández, she's a professor at the New York University. She was a lecturer in other universities. She carried out studies concerning the role of women in the production of income and capitals, and their impact and their role in societies. She will present us with a set of slides concerning women at work. This is a key issue for a society. If a society, because of its customs, deems that women should not work, they have a very limited view of the world compared with countries where women work. And the same goes for the attitude to marry women who work, and the direct relationship between those who are children of a woman who used to work. That increases the likelihood that they marry working women. Now the floor to Ráquel Fernández for her presentation. And so culture and economics are two very wild fields. And we'll try to understand the differences, the similarities, and the relationship between the two.
such an excellent conference. I don't think anywhere in the world have I seen 3 days in a city, and certainly not a city as marvelous as Trento, dedicated to economics, and it's quite fabulous. Okay, so Stefano already gave you some of the flavor of what I'm going to be talking about. And let me start by saying that economics has become central to modern life. Indeed, in the analysis of social problems, economic thinking, which places its emphasis on the structure of incentives, plays a starring role. Despite being an economist myself, I think that it's not too immodest to claim that the 20th century can be thought of as the century of the triumph of economics. And the triumph of this field and the success of its methodology has gradually spread into all the social sciences, raising cries of imperialism and fears of being taken over by crude economists. From the subjects of crime, to law, to marriage and fertility, to addiction, to civil wars, ethnic identity, educational reform, the structure of government, the formation of political parties, there are few, if any, topics that economists have not taken on. And to paraphrase a now dead and not very popular politician, we are all economists now. Okay. Now, the success of the economics methodology has been in large part due to the rigor and simplicity provided by its basic premises. It's based on taking the preferences, the taste, and the social beliefs of economic man as giving and facing this economic man or woman with the incentives provided by her environment. But where do these social beliefs and these preferences come from? We economists may believe, along with the ancient Greeks, that man is a social animal. But do we need to take into account man's social nature in order to understand and to think about social and economic questions? This is the issue with which I would like to talk about today by thinking about the effect of culture on economic outcomes. If social preferences and social beliefs vary across societies, and if they are, at least in part, socially constructed, and if this variation in beliefs and preferences affect economic outcomes, then this is a challenge that we economists must face and think about deeply, and also hopefully contribute to thinking about and contribute to understanding culture as well. So, I'm forgetting about my slides. Okay. So that's the first one. So let me outline a little bit what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so the first is going to continue along the line of thought I've been setting out now, which is talk about why does culture pose a challenge to economics? And also, what can economics contribute to understanding of culture? And in that second line of what economists can contribute to understanding culture, I'm going to be talking about, in particular, work of my own, which follows what I called the epidemiological approach, and thinking about women's participation in the formal labor market. And in the end, I'm going to conclude with some areas that I think are future challenges, both for people who are concerned about economics and those who are concerned about culture. Okay. So, you might ask, what is culture? And very often, in some lectures, you might face many, many slides on defining culture. For what I'm worried about today, you can think about it as a body of shared knowledge, understanding, and practice, and that's very vague, far too vague to be useful. Someone did a recent count, and in recent journals, I forget how many years, maybe the last 10, 20 years, there's over 170 definitions of culture written down. So I'm not going to try to contribute another one. For our purposes today, we can think about differences in culture as systematic variation in social beliefs and preferences across time, space, or across social groups. And I would like you to note from the outset that there's nothing in this definition that thinks of culture as necessarily static nor irrational. Okay. So let's go on to talk about how economists think about things. Now, when economists are faced with variation in aggregate outcomes, think about different savings rates across countries. Okay, why do the Japanese save more than the Americans say? They think about explaining this variation in aggregate outcomes with variation in economic, in institutions, in policies, and in technology. The same thing across individuals. If we think about why groups of individuals do different things, then again, we either want to look at differences in their environment or look at differences in their endowments. For example, how educated they are. Okay? In this type of exercise, which is the type of exercise that economists excel at, we take the distribution of agents' preferences and social belief, that is their culture, as given and invariant to the environment. Now, one thing that economists don't consider as being as a possible explanation is that this might be explained by differences in preferences and beliefs, that these variation in outcomes may be explained by differences in culture. Why not? Well, I think it's very well summarized in a very famous article by Stigler and Becker, De gustibus non est disputandum, and since I'm faced with Italians, you all speak Latin. This is about taste. We do not argue. We do not fight. Now, what's the problem with saying, okay, the differences in outcomes, they can be explained by differences in tastes? What's wrong with that? Well, the problem is, from a theoretical perspective, it's very, it has no rigor. I mean, we can't observe tastes. We can't observe beliefs. So to say that somebody, that Japan saves more than the United States because they have a different attitudes towards thrift, towards savings, is really not providing any explanation at all. Okay? The empirical counterpart, so that's just a theoretical exercise, but the empirical counterpart of this, which is to try to explain, again, differences in savings between Japan and the United States as a result of policies, technologies, institutions, different education levels, etc., and then call the part that you cannot explain culture, that is what we as economists would call the residual, that thing that we can't measure is culture, that's equally unsatisfying. I mean, yeah, maybe it's culture, but maybe you just didn't measure things properly. So that's very unsatisfactory to any economist. Economists tend to be rigorous, and consequently, economists have tended to ignore culture throughout the decades. Okay. There's another problem with thinking about cultural explanations, which I won't go into that much today, but which is really that it's very difficult to conduct welfare analysis if we take preferences as endogenous. So when economists try to make policy prescriptions, okay, like what should the tax rate be, or how should we fund Social Security, they think about the preferences of an individual as given, and they say, let's try to maximize the happiness of these people. That is, they take their taste as given and try to maximize what makes them happy. Well, if the taste varies according to the environment, according to the culture, and if this changes over time, so that when you change institutions, when you change the tax rates, when you change customs, it also changes preferences, then that exercise is kind of useless. I mean, we don't know what to do with it. So it's a very big challenge theoretically as well for economists, and that explains part of their reluctance. Still, overall, I would say that the main obstacle, to incorporating culture in economic analysis has really been the absence of serious empirical work that shows that culture matters to economic outcomes, not to what you eat. Everybody understands the Japanese eat sushi, the Italians eat pasta, but to economic outcomes. Okay. And in particular, as I've tried to explain, we can't rely on differences in what groups of people do. They could be doing it for many reasons. Nor can we rely on survey evidence, on attitudes expressed in surveys, because people have a tendency to say that they do what they do because they think it's a good idea to do it. So to say that people who work tend to work because they like to work, well, that's not clear. They also tend to say they like to work because they work, for example. So there's what we would call an endogeneity problem in that type of issue, which means we can't just take attitudes as evidence of anything. It's interesting, it's a clue, but it's not evidence. It's not rigorous for an economist. So the main challenge that economics has faced throughout the decades for thinking about culture is how do we separate differences in beliefs and in preferences from differences in the overall environments, from differences in institutions, or from differences in individual endowments, for example, education. Okay. So Only recently, I would say, that economists have started to take on this problem seriously, and there's several people in this room who have contributed to this work. I'm just going to be concentrating for now on work that I've done recently, actually with several Italian co-authors, that looks at women, work, and culture as a topic and tries to think about the influence of culture on women's relationship to the job market. Okay, you could ask, well, why women? Why women in work and culture? Okay, I would like to at least justify that choice. One is because it's a key economic outcome. Whether women work or not, whether they're staying at home or not, whether how many kids they're having, those are all things that matter tremendously to an economy. So this is definitely an economic outcome that's of concern to economists and to others. Why women in particular? I think women in particular have borne the brunt of culture. That is, over time, there is no doubt that we have seen gigantic differences over what women do and how society, and the way society expresses itself towards women, that is, what it believes that women should be doing, has changed over time. So I think that they're a good subject of analysis. Okay, next page. So to start out with just some pictures to give you some motivation. This is, I'm sorry, it's in English, it's married women who participate in the labor force in the United States. These are women who are between the ages of 25 to 44. They're white, they're married, they don't work in agriculture, they don't live on farms. In 1880, around 2% of these women were working, okay? And over time, as you can see in this graph, this percentage increased from 2% to about 74% in the year 2000. And as you can see, it's been a long time increase over 120 years or so. I can also show you just again here, just so that you can place maybe Italy. Italy is a very interesting exception. This is 1960 to 1995. Sweden, United States, UK, Germany, France, Netherlands. And as you can see, all of these are increasing over time. And interestingly, Italy is a little bit stuck. But so that's an interesting exception. It'd be interesting to think a little bit about why that might be true. So if you were to ask a traditional economist, why is it that women's role has changed throughout time? Take whichever of these pictures you most like, except for the Italian one. Okay, why is it that women's role has changed over time? The favorite answer an economist is going to give you, the instinctive one, is technology. And there's many aspects of technology that have undoubtedly changed and undoubtedly helped to change women's role. So the favorite ones are household appliances, the washing machine, the vacuum cleaner. Economists talk about household appliances liberating the women from the drudgery of the household. There's things like infant formula, latte in polvo, okay? That's the, now you don't have to breastfeed your child necessarily. You can give them infant formula and you can go back to work. There's modern contraception, which allows women to control their fertility much more and invest in careers. So different forms of technology have been thought of as throughout time allowing women to work more. There's also structural change, but that's also a form of technology. There's the decreased importance of brawn, of physical strength, and the increased importance of brain, and women have a relative advantage in brain over brawn, and therefore they go and work more, okay? What about changes in attitudes or changes in culture and all this? Where are these things? Could that be a possible explanation? I'm sure if I asked most people, I think in this room, certainly off the street, they would say, yes, culture is really important. Yes, there's been really important changes in attitudes, and that matters. But that's not what economists talk about. So here's some very indirect evidence, if you need any, that attitudes have changed. This is a poll that's been asking the question, do you approve of a wife working if her husband can support her? Now, this is a question that's been asked in various forms from 1936 to the year almost 2000, with some big interruption, though, around the World War periods, okay? So as you can see, in 1936, less than 20% of society approved of a married woman working if her husband was able to support her. By the year 2000, the situation is completely reversed. Less than 20% disapprove of a woman working if her husband can support her. You can see there's been gigantic changes in attitudes. Now, again, as I said, for the same reasons as before, showing that attitudes have changed, while interesting, while indicative of something, does not prove anything by itself. Attitudes change, but so what? It could be, I think here it's a little bit ironic, but economists tend to be, as you know, rather conservative, but here they act like primitive Marxists. I think that your typical economist would believe, yes, beliefs might have changed, attitudes might have changed, but these attitudes just reflect the important parts of the economy, the technology. Somehow when technology changes, preferences change, beliefs change. So it's not that these beliefs actually cause women to work more, rather technology causes women to work more, and these beliefs just change along with them. Okay, maybe a little bit more of an idea that beliefs might matter was given in some previous work I did with two Italian co-authors, Alessandra Fogli and Claudio Olivetti. Now, what we did was to show that men whose mothers worked while they were growing up tended to be married to women who also worked, okay? And we call this marrying your mother, okay? But a little bit incestuous, but yes. Now, we made sure this was not driven by education, by wealth, by the region of the country that we're living in, by any socioeconomic factors. This was a very strong relationship in the data. In fact, the quantitative impact was really huge. The effect of having a mother who worked increased the probability that your own wife was going to work for a man by 32 percentage points. So the average person was working 39%. If your husband's mother worked, the probability that you worked increased to 71%. And we argued that there was some evidence, therefore, of a preference or belief transmission. We also looked at some dynamic evidence of our theory provided by things that happened during World War II. So in the United States, during World War II, there was different percentages of men who were mobilized, who were drafted, who were sent to fight. In those states where more men were sent to fight, more women stepped into the labor force, and therefore more women worked, because the men were gone. Somebody had to do the work. So in those states, there were more men brought up by working women. And according to the theory that we had exposited at that moment, we said it was going to be more attractive also for married women to work in those states. And in particular, what we would tend to see is that more women overall would work in those states because they would know that there's more men around there who support them working. They would invest more in market skills, and they would work more when they were older. And indeed, when we looked at the empirical evidence, we found that this correlation held. That is, in those states in which more men had gone to war, and consequently more women brought up boys, okay, and they were working, then for those cohorts of people, those cohorts of boys and those cohorts of girls, the women tended to work more in those states. And we showed this is not true for earlier cohorts. Okay, I'm just going to give you one more piece of evidence, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, which is to say that simply contemporaneously, these large differences continue to exist. So the slide that you're seeing in front of you right now shows female labor force participation in the year 2003 for OECD countries. And as you can see, it varies from a low of about 20-something% from Turkey, and Italy's right down there right after Mexico, to a high of over 80% for Iceland and Sweden over 70%, okay? So there's tremendous variation in the data, and the question is this variation that we see in the data, is that driven by things that vary in the countries, technologies, institutions, policies? Is it driven by endowments of individuals, by how educated people are in Turkey relative to Norway or to Iceland? Or is it also, I'm not exclaiming exclusivity, is it also driven by culture, by beliefs about the role of women. Okay, so that's what I would like to address today. So to address this question, I'm going to follow what I've called the epidemiological approach. So what epidemiologists do is when they want to study outcomes like, why is it that in Japan there are lower rates of heart disease than, say, in the United States? I don't know where Italy lies in all this. Okay, why is it that they suffer less heart attacks in Japan, the men, than in the United States? Is it genetics, or is it, is it the environment? Is it something about living in Japan? Okay, the food they eat, the air they breathe, the type of microbes that exist, etc. Well, when they want to study something like that, one way that they can do it is they can look at immigrants, Japanese immigrants, say in the United States, and look at whether the heart disease for immigrants or the sons and daughters of immigrants in the United States, of Japanese ones, converges to the heart disease of men and women in the United States. If they do converge, if they end up having basically the same rate of heart disease, then we can be pretty sure it's not genetics that's driving it, okay? Because now they look like US people. So then we can conclude it's environment. If there is not convergence, then one's not sure what it is. You know, it could be genetics, but maybe it could be, still something like cultural things, like what you eat. Maybe the diet of Japanese and the descendants of Japanese in the United States is different from that of Americans. Okay, so in one case you can conclude something, in another case you're not sure. Okay, so this is the epidemiological approach followed for health questions. I'm going to be applying this type of approach to study culture and its effects on economics. So here one can ask, are cross-country differences in economic outcomes, for example, again, let's say savings rate or the amount women work, are they driven by economic institutional factors, or does culture play a quantitative role? So it's no longer genetics, but culture versus economics and institutional factors. Now here you face a whole different set of problems that you do for health outcomes. The behavior of immigrants, for example, may be differentially affected by shocks, by language difficulties, by employment. There's assimilation that occurs over time. So even if culture is really important to understand why Turks do what they do in Turkey and why Norwegians do what they do in Norway, it may not really help to understand what they do in the United States, because now they become like US people. There's selection. That's very important. The typical Italian that has immigrated, the Italian that's immigrated to the United States is not necessarily the typical Italian. This may not be the person who represents the culture of Italy. So they may have a whole different set of beliefs, okay? In fact, the very first paper that used what I've called the epidemiological approach to study culture and economics was a paper by Carol and Ree, and they studied the savings behavior of immigrants to Canada, and indeed they found no significant effect of culture. That is, it was not true, for example, that Asian immigrants to Canada saved at any different rate than other immigrants, okay? So there seemed to be culture doesn't matter. Now, what I do with Alessandra Fogli in a series of papers is to examine what I would argue is a less problematic sample. We look at second-generation Americans. To be clear, second-generation Americans are people whose parents were born outside the United States, but who themselves were born in the United States. So their parents may be Italian, Turkish, Polish, but they themselves were born and raised in the US. What's good about this group? Well, you would think that shocks and unobserved economic factors are less important, but the problems of cultural assimilation remains and gets exacerbated. They may be even more assimilated, so that's a bit problematic. And the basic idea here is a very simple one. Women who were born in the United States with foreign-born parents, they face the same market prices, they face the same institutions. By construction, they're all living in the United States, they went to school in the United States, they were born and raised there, okay? But because of their parents' heritage, they may have different beliefs, they may have different preferences about women's role, about ideal family size, about a whole host of issues. What we're going to do is to study the behavior of these women, these second-generation women, and we're going to be using as our cultural variable proxy I've used before, but variable, the level of female labor force participation in the parent's country of origin. Okay? So let me be clear about this. When I say we're going to be using the level of female labor force participation in the country of origin, let's think about what that's influenced by. Okay? So we're looking at how much women work, say, in Italy. That's influenced by economic and institutional factors, so their wages, what the probabilities that they're going to find a job, the location of their job relative to their house, their husband's income, the cost of daycare, the quality of daycare, many economic, institutional factors. It's also influenced by cultural factors, that is, one's own beliefs and preferences about working versus not working, how you would be treated if you worked versus not worked, by your friends, by your families, by the neighbors. It's influenced by perhaps by how the media portrays working women, etc. By changing the country in which these women are in, that is, by not looking at Italians and Italy versus Norwegians in Norway, but by looking at American women in the United States who have different heritages, I can be sure that we have the same economic variables, the same institutional variables, the same policy variables, and the only thing that could be different across these women is their culture, what their parents have talked to them about, okay? What their parents have transmitted. Okay? Now, I want to be very clear. This is a very asymmetrically powerful test. There are many reasons why female labor force participation may not have explanatory value, even if culture matters. We've talked about assimilation already. There's a usual reason that female labor force participation may be mismeasured. There's a selection argument that we've talked about previously. May not be the typical woman who's here. Sorry, the immigrant may not be the typical person. And most importantly, culture is socially constructed, and the social incentives may be different. That is, the rewards and punishment to acting one way relative to another way may be very different. Thus, let me just say from the outset, if in our work we had found no role for culture, we would not have concluded that culture is not important. There's just too many reasons for this test to fail. On the other hand, if we do find that female labor force participation is able to explain what women do, then I have to say that culture has passed a very demanding test. Okay. The big challenge that this work faces, and that's been faced with various degrees of success by different works, is that there also exist economic channels of intergenerational transmission. Parents do not just transmit beliefs to their children. Unfortunately, they also transmit other things that we worry about as economists. They might transmit education, they may transmit wealth, they may transmit ability. So the big question for an economist who's interested in studying this and therefore has very demanding levels of rigor to pass is, have we adequately controlled for differences in economic variables? So let me tell you what we did. We looked at, as I said, second-generation women in the United States using the 1970 census, just because of technical reasons. We looked at married women. That's where the action is in terms of working versus not working. They're 30 to 40 years old, and they're not in agriculture. Okay. So the first question we had to face is, from what decade should we use the female labor force participation in the parent's country of origin? And you can make arguments from using anywhere from 1930 to 1970. Note, these are women who are 30 to 40 years old in 1970 in the US. Consequently, their parents, who were born outside the United States, could not have come to the United States any later than 1930 or 1940. So one might want to use 1930, 1940 variables. Those are not available. So, for data reasons, we use 1950. We also show that it's robust to other decades. We exclude a whole group of countries from the USSR and from centrally planned economies because they had very large changes in their economy and in their culture, but the parents were not there when this happened. Our final sample is 6,700 women from 25 countries. This is a representative sample in the United States. These women were working on average 10 hours per week, okay? 10 hours per week in 1970. They had about 3 kids, okay? The labor force participation of women in countries in 1950 is on average about 24%, and women were having between about 3.5 kids at that point. Let me show you the sample because it's really important that you get an idea of the countries that are involved. So if you look at that graph over there, on the x-axis, you'll see female labor force participation in 1950. And on the y-axis, you see how many hours women worked per week in 1970 if their father was born in these countries, okay? And if I was standing there, I'd point, but as you can see, most of these countries are European. Italy is lost in that big thing in the middle over there, that cluster of countries. But, you know, you have Italy, Norway, Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, Austria, Finland, etc. You also have China, Japan, and Turkey. You have some Latin American countries, Cuba and Mexico. You also have some Middle Eastern countries such as Lebanon and Syria. Okay, so that's the sample, 6,700 women from 25 countries. Okay. What we did was sorry, let me go back. What we did was to basically document that this relationship, which probably should have a regression line, exists. That is, there's a positive correlation between how much women worked in 1950 in their father's country of ancestry and how much these women are working today in the working in 1970 in the United States. Now, we documented this in a variety of ways. One of the most important things for us to do was to control for a women's level of education. So we included education as an explanatory variable. Why is it important to do this? It's important to do this because if you don't, it could all be driven by levels of education, and it could just be that women whose parents come from countries where women tend to work more are also richer, more educated, their child tends to be more educated, and it's harder for more educated women not to work. Why? Because their wages are higher, so they lose more by not going to work, okay, than for a woman whose wages are lower. So we wanted to make sure that was true, so we controlled for education. We also controlled for the education of their husband and for the income of their husband. The relationship, instead of becoming stronger, became weaker. The quantitative effect was very large. In particular, for the average woman in the sample, that is, for the woman whose education is average, who's married to the average man, the man with an average education, with average income. That woman, if she has parents who come from Lebanon, rather than if she have parents who come from Finland, is going to work 22% less. This is a large quantitative effect in economics, okay? It's 1/5 of the hours. So that was our finding. What we were mainly concerned about was to make sure and to demonstrate strictly to economists and to ourselves that there was not some, what I would call, a strictly economic variable that's able to explain these facts, okay? So our main source of concern was unobserved human capital. Think of education, but more education more generally. Unobserved human capital embodied either in the woman herself or in her ethnic network, since we know that your social networks also matter to the probability with which you find a job or to the quality of a job she finds. So one thing, I'm just going to run you very quickly through a few exercises. One of the things that you could do is to include what the per capita income was in 1950 in the parent's country of ancestry and ask, maybe this is really explaining it. It's not anything else. It's just that you haven't measured human capital correctly. Because although you've controlled for the years of education of the woman, maybe her parents have taught her things that you are not capturing in years of education. So let me show you very quickly. That's certainly not going to be a potential explanation. This is, again, sorry, the x-axis here is the 1950 gross domestic product per capita. And again, on the y-axis, we have how many hours women were working in the United States if their parents came from this country. And as I think the relationship is fairly clear, it's a negative one. So there's no way that this is going to be able to explain why it is that women work more if in the past women worked more in their father's country of ancestry. Another explanation is that it could be the years of education of their parents. So we used another data set and we showed that that wasn't true. Now this was a much smaller data set, so another way you could do this is you can go to the 1940 census in the United States and tried to find out how many years of education immigrants to the United States had in 1940. As we said before, these are not a representative sample necessarily. So we did that, and let me just show you. This is on the x-axis, how many years of education mothers and men and women from these different countries that you see on this graph had on average. Okay? And as you can see, now there is a positive relationship. So it does appear that if your parents came from countries, if your parents came from groups from countries where immigrants tend to have higher education, that might help to explain how much you worked yourself in the United States. And this does indeed have explanatory power, but not once you include female labor force participation in the parents' country of ancestry. That is, if I can't show you, I'm not going to show you a regression, but if you were putting in both explanatory variables, years of education and female labor force participation in 1950, only female labor force participation in 1950 would have explanatory power for that. Okay. Actually, let me just go back. There's other possibilities. I think the most direct test that we did was to look at wages directly. So in economics, one thing that we do is we do things called wage regressions, which we look at how can we explain wages. And usually we explain wages with your age, your education, things like that, your sex, etc. You can do these type of regressions and ask, does how much women worked in your parents' country of ancestry, does that help to explain wages? If it did, it would be very problematic for us, because if it helps to explain wages, there might be some element of human capital that we're not capturing. And indeed, the answer is no. Female labor force participation does not help to explain wages, so we were pretty satisfied with the robustness and the strength of our explanatory variable. Okay. The last few slides I'm going to show you before I turn over the floor to questions has to do with similar work that I did, but this time on attitudes. I also use, again, what I call an epidemiological approach. That is, I'm looking at the same type of sample that you saw here, except I'm just going to look at Europeans in this case. And what I can make use of is that in 1990, the World Value Survey asked two questions to individuals, and this is a representative survey, that had to do with their attitudes toward women and women's work. So question number one was, is being a housewife is just as fulfilling as working for pay? And you were asked, did you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with this question? And again, number two, having a job is the best way for a woman to be an independent person. And again, strong, agree, disagree, and strongly disagree with this question. What I do is I look at the average attitude, that is the percentage of people who agree or strongly agree with a statement in the country of ancestry in 1990, and I ask the epidemiological question, which is, does this percentage help explain the work behavior in the United States in 1970? Now, the survey's in 1990. These are women in 1970. I'm asking Germans, Italians, French, and I'm asking, does what they answer help to predict what women in 1970 did in the United States, not in Germany, not in France, not in Italy, but in the United States in 1970. Okay, so that's the epidemiological structure. And here you can see the results. On the x-axis is the percentage of individuals who disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, being a housewife is as fulfilling as working for pay. As you can see, there are some countries where the percentage is relatively high that strongly disagreed in 1990. So about 50% for Portugal, Germany, Norway. Even Italy is fairly high. It's between 40 and 45%. And down there, the people who are really disagreeing with this, the people who less tend to disagree. So there's only 25% or so of people who disagree for Turkey and for Ireland, for example. And again, you can see there's a strong positive relationship. This is, again, you can control for the women's education, for her husband's education, for her husband's income. What people answer in 1990 helps to predict what they do. Countries that are more conservative, they have women who who, although born in the United States and although the year is 1970, in this country they tend to, in the United States they tend to work less. If they're less conservative, that is more likely to disagree with this statement, then they tend to work more. Very similar pattern is found for the question, the job is the best way for women to be independent. Again, you know, if you, now I have the percentage who agreed or strongly agreed in 1990 on the x-axis. As you see, it's a bit different than before. Now a lot more people are agreeing that the job is the best way for women to be independent. But again, the people who most think this is true, where the percentages are high, are again Denmark, Portugal, France, Sweden, Norway. Again, Italy is somewhere in the middle. And then the outliers are kind of England, Netherlands, Ireland. Okay? And again, on the x-axis, sorry, on the y-axis, you see the average hours worked per week in the United States in 1970. And again, there's a very strong positive correlation. For women, if your father was born in a country where people tend to say a job is the best way for women to be independent, you are more likely to work more in the United States in 1970 than if your father is born in a country where people do not express that point of view. So culture does seem to be transmitted, at least intergenerationally. I'm going to show you two more pieces of evidence. One's just out of interest, I think. And the other one should give you some more evidence that this is culture at work. And then I'm going to open the floor. One is, one question one can ask, since we're looking at married people here, is whether it's the woman's ancestry that matters to her work behavior, or is it her husband's ancestry? To study this, we look at those couples in our large sample, okay, the sample of 6,700 women from 25 countries, who have mixed ancestry. That is, their father was born in one country, but their husband's father was born in another country. What we found was quite interesting. We did this for fertility outcomes and for work. We found that for work outcomes, if anything, the man seems to be more important than the woman. That is, where his father was born. That is, how much women worked in his father's country of ancestry rather than in her father's country of ancestry seems to be the stronger explanatory variable. For fertility, things are not like that. For fertility, both seem to be equally important. And that seems like a very interesting asymmetry and would be interesting to explore in the future. The last thing that we did to sort of convince ourselves that this might be culture that we're picking up rather than something else was to ask whether there's a role other than your parents in transmitting culture. And in particular, does the neighborhood that you live in matter at all? So what we did was to rely on data by Borjas, who's a prominent researcher in the area of immigration. And what he did was to look at what I'm going to call ethnic neighborhood density data. That is, these are measures of residential segregation for second-generation Americans. Let me say this in plain English, or hopefully, if she translates, in plain Italian, okay? What I'm doing is, what we're looking at is, if you take an Italian who's living in a neighborhood in the United States, on average, what percentage of the neighborhood is also Italian, okay? There are some ethnicities, in particular Italians, who do tend to live together. And there are some ethnicities that don't tend to live together. You would think that if culture matters, the role of culture would be more strong when you tend to live with people who are like you than when you tend to live with people who are from all sorts of beliefs and all sorts of nationalities. So in particular, if you take the countries that most tend to live together, as you can see there, are Mexico, 18%. So you take a Mexican, that Mexican tends to be living in a neighborhood which is also 18% generation Mexican. Japanese also tend to live together, 12%, Italians as well. The low ones are Turkey, France, and Lebanon, okay? They're all about 0.3%, okay? And what we asked is the effect of the cultural variable, that is female labor force participation, increasing in your tendency to live with people like yourself? And the answer to this was a definitive yes, and again, it made us more confident that indeed we're picking up culture. Okay, I think that this methodology of looking at immigrants and their descendants is a very useful one for studying culture and a whole list of other questions that one might be interested in economics. from altruism to trust to, how hard, say, men work across different countries, to careers, education, fertility, environmental practices, attitudes towards redistribution. Do we believe it's luck or do we believe it's effort? All sorts of things that really do matter to how we express ourselves in the workplace, how we express ourselves when we vote for politicians, things that matter to economic outcomes. I think it could be profitably applied. I also think that I've talked a lot at the beginning about the challenges that culture places for economics, and it is indeed a challenge. As I said, one was empirical. How do we ever manage to do it? And there's been a whole group of economists recently who have been trying to show that culture does matter. But also, as I said, how do we do policy? Let me end up by stressing the positive things about economics and culture. I think economics is a discipline that can help us think rigorously and quantitatively about a whole host of questions in culture that before have not really been able to be thought about in these terms. In particular, we can try to quantify and think about the importance of the different transmission channels. How important are parents relative to neighborhoods, to schools, to whom you marry? Is the cultural transmission optimizing? That is, some of you heard Alberto Bizin the other day. He does believe that it's optimizing, that his parents are choosing to give a cultural identity to their children. Or is it involuntary? Is it just that, you just can't help transmit a certain attitude, whether you like it or not, whether it's useful or not? How does culture interact with institutions? How do institutions affect cultural change? Maybe because of a certain economic, let's call them accidents, the United States ended up with slavery. That's an institution. That institution may have consequences for people's cultural attitudes. That is, it may help make people racist, where without that institution, they wouldn't become racist. So very different differences in geography, differences in endowment, differences in historical, let's call them accidents, for want of a better word, can end up having profound influences later on. And then when does, the last one is, when does culture change rapidly? When does it change gradually? And here I think definitely technology plays a very important role. But I think we also want to think about technology as endogenous and responding to cultural demands. To respond, the contraceptive, the pill did not happen by accident. It was desired. The vacuum cleaner may not have happened by accident. Maybe it was desired because women wanted to go out and work. Okay, thank you.
Dunque, mi sembra molto significative le cose che abbiamo visto. Ci sono parecchi spunti, credo, per
a lot of food for thought. I'd like to give the floor to the audience. Are there any questions? Any comments from the floor? It is clear that the culture and economy are closely related, as it is clear in some macro phenomena. Are there any questions or comments from the floor? So I'll ask the first question to break the ice. That refers to the final comments you made, i.e. that culture changes rapidly or glacially. So have you realized during your research whether, rather, are you aware of the time necessary for a community of persons and not only of migrants, how much it takes for them to be aware that a cultural change has happened, and what are the reasons why this cultural change is realized by the community?
when it comes to music, right? Okay, you know, we don't listen to necessarily to the same music as our parents do. Now, I think that culture has been changing extremely rapidly, and I do think here economics has had a profound effect. And I think that the effect comes not necessarily from technology, but from the effect of competition. So I think that the fact that globalization has occurred and become more profound makes countries have to shift their practices. Not necessarily to better or worse practices. I'm not going to take a normative view here necessarily, but they have to change their practices in order to compete. So, you know, it might be very nice to say, let's have a society in which we all work 30 hours a week, but it might be very difficult to institute that and to pay that when there's other societies in which people are working much harder. So it's not necessarily a question, as I said, of optimality. It's just a question of competitiveness and how one deals with that. I also think that this is to echo Danielle Cohen's talk from the first day on technology and the post-industrial society. The television is having a profound effect. And one thing that he remarked upon is that even in rural areas, even in areas where the economy has not changed in the slightest, women, when they watch TV, they see a different way of life in front of them, a life with 1 or 2 kids where women are much freer to do what they want, and fertility has changed in these groups of people. So we're seeing that even in countries and areas which had not yet undergone the demographic transition, fertility has fallen rapidly. And it would be very interesting to study this more rigorously.
Appunto. Qualche altra domanda?
What about the influence of the economy on culture? I am an entrepreneur, and I must say that there was not very much culture in the economy. All times I tried to add culture to economy, I made more profits, if you know what I mean. So this is it. Maybe I didn't make myself clear. For example, the knowledge of a city. Working in Milan, a city which changed very rapidly over 10 years, where they changed their economic structure, with a lot of changes and development in the different neighborhoods in the area of Bovisa, where the technical university is, and the value of real estate went up. Houses were very cheap many years ago. Now, those who had forecast that because of the technical university, real estate could be had a much more higher value, well, they made a lot of profits. Now, I'm not saying that one should exploit culture to make profits, but being knowledgeable, is useful. I mean, I'm not only referring to profits. I think that if you work under the influence of culture, you work better and in a much more beautiful way.
You want to answer?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a challenge for economics still, that is to see how much the surroundings in which individuals are affects, for example, like you say, their productivity, okay, their ability to be creative, for example. And this is something that certainly at the level of the firms is being realized. I mean, you read articles in the newspapers about the type of work environment that people have in Google or in Microsoft, and you know, they have these creativity hours, and they get to do paintings, and they have, you know, all sorts of wonderful things that we don't have in the university. And, you know, you're quite envious because in some arenas, particularly arenas in which there's a lot of rapid innovation going on, there seems to be very much of an appreciation for the effect that having a stimulating work environment, a work environment that's not routine and dull, might have on individuals. I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but this is, I think, is something that's being faced by the cutting edge level of entrepreneurs, but not yet by civil servants, by university professors, let alone by janitors.
Altre domande? Lì, questo ragazzo.
Buongiorno, io sono studente presso la Facoltà di Economia di Trento e volevo fare questa domanda. Spesso quando si analizza ultimamente il tema economia e cultura si prende, cioè la comunità immigrazione, cioè la comunità che vengono l'immigrazione, queste comunità. E praticamente si vedono questi fenomeni, no? Io volevo chiedere cosa bisogna fare verso questi paesi? Bisogna fare una selezione dove realmente certi paesi la fanno in modo tale che, cioè, noi prendiamo da questi paesi la gente più educata, più istruita, più culturata, che hanno cultura, o bisogna tentare di esportare questo modello di cultura in modo tale che poi anche l'immigrazione si sia meglio organizzata o meglio integrata? Grazie.
Sì, se posso fare una chiosa, cioè quando si parla di cultura, almeno in questo contesto, credo di poter interpretare anche abbastanza correttamente quello che dice l'economista Ráquel Fernández. Non è che stiamo parlando di grado di istruzione, ma proprio anche di modo di vita, diciamo così, diciamo di abitudini e preferenze culturali. Ecco, questo è una specie.
I've been dreading a policy question, I have to confess, because I think it's quite premature in many senses to start talking about what's optimal and what our knowledge of culture and how it affects economic outcomes, how it should be used to change immigrant flows, change residential policies, for example, not allow people to live in the same area, and rather integrate them into society. I'm not yet ready, and I don't think the economics profession is yet ready to make those pronouncements, because the study of these issues is truly, truly in its infancy. That said, I think that that's where the interesting questions do lie, and I hope that you're going to take some of these on in your dissertation, because it really is a question not so much about, I think, restricting migrant flows, because migrant flows have been boons to so many economies, the United States onwards. Okay, it's been so positive for so many countries. The question has really been, when faced with the problems of the 20th or the early 21st century problems, which are a very different type of problems that were faced at the beginning of the 20th century, when there's great competition for jobs and there's a lot of job insecurity, how do we deal with immigration? How do we integrate people, if that is the right thing to do? And I think we're just not really ready to pronounce something here.
Prego. Sì.
Is the metropolitan city which is now going through a change that has been experienced by other big cities, that is due to strong migration flows. There is a lively debate as to whether it is better to go for a multicultural model or for a cultural integration model. And at the moment, there is some criticism towards both models, the English multicultural one and the French one, multicultural integration. And the failure of both models is clear. So you rightly told us that economists are unable at the moment to provide us with a description of what is best. But in terms of public policy, this topic is a highly debated one. So I would like to be provocative and ask you, do you think that in terms of interaction between institutions and cultures, do you believe that institutions should interact in a different way depending on the reference culture of each individual? Say, the culture of the migration nucleus? Is my question clear enough?
I mean, I'm happy as economic science. So your questions really have to do with how, how we should be interacting with the fact that there's many cultures living in the same area. One would be, well, just let them be, okay, laissez-faire. The other possibility, as you're saying, is, if you want to try to integrate, then one can try to integrate this. I mean, for this, I do think that residential policies tremendously matter, okay? So I do think that one would like to have, especially when it comes to low-income housing, and this is true not just for immigrants, this is just true for poor segments of society in general. It's not a very good idea to have only poor people living with poor people. Society fares much better. I think there's studies that show that there's much more intergenerational mobility when poor people live with middle-class people. Okay, there's many more peer effects, there's many more positive examples, there's many more social networks that get formed. So I would believe that would be true at the immigrant case, although I don't really know the evidence for this question. Then there's all sorts of other things about institutions. I mean, I don't know what the state of the debate right now currently is in Italy with respect to, say, such hot issues as the veil, letting Muslim women wear the veil in schools. My own attitude would be, of course they should be able to. Why not? I mean, this is not something that as an economist we would say produces by itself any negative effects. If one said, well, women couldn't go to school, or women couldn't study X, or women can't do sports if they come from certain religions, that would be something that's tremendously bothersome. But things that are symbolic, every culture, I think, should be left its own symbols, even if you like them or not. Let them change on their own. But this is not economic science.
Sì, infatti apre parecchi rivoli una risposta di questo genere, ma era la domanda stessa che li implicava. Altre domande?
I do not study economics. I work in the sector of sciences, food sciences and agriculture. And I have a comment rather than a question. That is, my family lives in Canada. And I'm here in Italy. I was born in Italy and I live here in Trento. And I believe that Italy and Canada tackle the issue of immigration in a totally different way. I frequently go back to Canada. I've attended university there. And I can see that in Italy, where I work now, but it was very difficult for me to find a job. Well, in Italy, for a woman, I mean, if you're a woman, if you're young, you have 10 times more problems and difficulties than a man, and we should be ashamed of this. I believe our politicians should be ashamed of this. I mean, if you're young, they tell you, if you're young, you know nothing, and they ask you to do anything. Things that do not improve your professionalism, that are not gratifying, then do not allow you to grow and to become enriched from a professional viewpoint. Moreover, if you're a woman, that's it, you're out. You're half crucified. If you're a woman, no, we're not going to employ you because you're going to get pregnant soon. You would just be a cost. And this problem is an Italian problem. Conversely, abroad, I was very young, and they gave me many more chances, and I had a totally different relationship. Also, immigrants were viewed in a totally different way. Immigrants of every origin, not only Italian ones like myself, but also Muslims, Indians, independent of their religion and their country of origin. So in Italy, very often there is a discrimination. If you come from a country, from the East, so to say, your value is not properly recognized. So I can see a political correlation regarding the way how immigration is managed and how institutions are managed. Right. I mean, this is not a question, it is just a comment that I wanted to make. The observation of a person who moves backwards and forwards between Italy and Canada. Yes, well, I would like to add a question for Professor Fernandez. Do you believe that in some cases governments do impose things on society and oblige, for instance, the society to protect women at work and stating, for instance, certain wage levels which, due to cultural reasons, may not be accepted? Sure. Be lobbied into doing something, because I mean sometimes they should do something more. Let's pretend that we lobby them to obtain an act so that we can have a higher percentage of women in politics or equal career opportunities. I mean, when you realize from a cultural viewpoint that this would be useful, but it is difficult to implement it, do you think that we should request an act from our governments?
A lot of women like you who lived in Canada and had one sort of experience, came to Italy, have another source of experience. That would be a wonderful way to test also the importance of culture, and in a very different way than the one I've done, because what I did was to say, we keep the institutions the same and we just look at your beliefs as expressed in your outcomes. But you could actually see the full importance of culture, because culture also has an impact on the institutions. If you have a male chauvinist culture, you're much more likely to have male chauvinist institutions. You're much less likely to impose anti-discrimination laws. And even if you have anti-discrimination laws, you're much less likely to enforce them. So, you know, I want to use your comment as an opportunity to make sure that it was very clear that what I did gives a minimum sense of the importance, the quantitative importance of culture, because I didn't allow institutions to change. I didn't allow the Italian woman to be faced with sexist institutions in Italy. No, she was faced with the same institutions as her Norwegian counterpart in the United States. So I would love to have a whole sample of women who lived and worked in two different countries, because then you would be able to keep the women constant but change the institutions that they were subjected to. Now, the question, should we lobby to change our institutions? Should we lobby to change our governments? Well, that's the point of living in a democracy. We should indeed lobby, you know, to have our politicians reflect our preferences and social desires. And often that's very difficult and very costly, and even large segments of society might oppose it. I can speak at least with a little bit of knowledge of the United States, where this has been true both for women and for blacks, okay, where it's been intense lobbying and intense social movements that have helped change government and institutions, even perhaps before a large segment of society was ready to do this. It's not at all clear that the United States was or is ready to accept full integration with, say, blacks in the United States, yet at least the laws require it, and there is some enforcement of these laws. Now, how one does this, is this a good idea to put quotas on? Well, I don't know. We've seen a lot of disastrous outcomes in the United States when we've had things like affirmative action. We've also seen good things. So maybe it depends on the stage at which they are imposed. Maybe having affirmative action for the number of university professors who are female is not a very good idea. Maybe having affirmative action for the number of students who are encouraged to study physics and chemistry, who are women, who will study those things, is a good idea. So I think one has to think very carefully about the structure of incentives, and I think that's kind of what economists would be good at thinking about, and thinking about the consequences of this. But go ahead and lobby. I'm all for that.
Sì. Altre domande? Abbiamo tempo ancora per una o due domande. Nessuno? Allora faccio io un'ultima domanda che è questa. Mi ha sorpreso, colpisce il fatto che ci siano dei gruppi di emigrati che, ripeto, mi ha sorpreso e mi ha colpito che ci siano dei gruppi di emigrati che tendono ad avere dei vicini, diciamo così, di rapporti di vicinato con provenienti dalla stessa patria d'origine. Volevo sapere quanto invece accelera la possibilità di cambiare modo di vita l'essere il più propensi possibile al mischiarsi con altri gruppi etnici, e se è mai capitato negli studi che è stato fatto che a un certo punto si sia verificato una scelta culturale, diciamo così, sbagliata, che abbia premiato in qualche modo un atteggiamento etnico o tradizionale meno competitivo, meno vantaggioso per la società.
For example?
No, non lo so se c'è un esempio. No. È giusto una domanda, non so se si sia mai verificato.
I must be quite honest and say that what I've studied so far is women's work and fertility outcomes. And you can say that in some sense, people are losing from an economic point of view because of their attitudes. Because, you know, if they work less, they earn less, they have less opportunities to educate their children. There's a whole series of consequences that come from this. But in terms of some, natural experiment that has been provided by society in which, for some reason, some behavior was rewarded, there I'm less certain. Yeah, but.
Okay. Va bene. Se non ci sono altre domande, no. Chiudiamo, allora ringraziamo Ráquel Fernández.
Thank you. Grazie.
Soprattutto per la chiarezza con la quale ha dimostrato le sue tesi, e vi ringraziamo e alla prossima.